Hello, everyone. My name is Arindam Paul, and today I'm going to present to you a paper titled Error Handling of In-Vehicle Networks Makes Them Vulnerable. So the agenda which we will go through in this particular presentation will include an introduction, a background on automotive security, a primer on CAN networks, their frames, and the error handling state machine of a CAN network, the bus-off attack model, which is proposed by the researchers, a feasibility study, which was done by the researchers of this attack, and the evaluation or the actual execution of this bus-off attack, the countermeasures which were proposed to counter such an attack were it to happen in a CAN network as proposed by the researchers, and the final conclusion which we can draw out of this paper. So this particular slide set includes material which were presented by the researchers from the University of Michigan, Kong-Tak Cho and Kang Shane. The paper was originally presented in the 2016 Conference on Complex Systems in the Netherlands, and it essentially demonstrates a new vulnerability of in-vehicle networks of modern cars. And the vulnerability was done by, or was demonstrated by exploiting the error handling mechanism of the CAN network. It also goes in to propose countermeasures to prevent or to detect such type of an attack. So let's start off with a little bit background on what CAN networks are, or in-vehicle networks are. So most modern vehicles use a number of electronic control units, or ECUs, as well as wireless connectivities. Because of the presence of these wireless connectivities or endpoints, it makes it much more easier for an adversary to exploit and control a vehicle remotely. But car manufacturers over the years, as well as researchers, have acknowledged that, or they understand that the increase in the vulnerability. But so in order to counter that, they have introduced intrusion detection systems and message authentication codes, or MACs. But this researchers, they think that, or they rather prove that these countermeasures or these prevention mechanisms which are there are not enough. So let's try to understand a little bit further what is meant by a CAN network or an in-vehicle network. So here we are showing you a network of ECUs which are connected over a bus within the vehicle. And these electronic control units transmit various data between themselves, which are essentially sensor information, for example, tire pressure, engine acceleration, brakes, health of the brakes, which help in controlling the vehicle, as well as developing levels of fault tolerance within the cars themselves. So here we show a few ECUs transmitting data, and each data has an ID which is associated with it, which essentially identifies what the content of that data signifies. And so next we talk a little bit about the current state of art for defenses in a CAN network. So this is a case where the defense mechanism is one of authentication, where once a message is generated by one of the ECUs and sent out onto the bus, the receiving ECUs do an authentication of the message itself, and based on the authentication success or failure, the message is either accepted or denied by an ECU. Another mechanism which is used is the use of IDSs within this bus network, and in order to deny to prevent denial of service attacks, and to detect the presence of an attack happening in the system. So the researchers, the mechanisms which the researchers present in this paper essentially are able to go around these systems and still mount an attack. In order to understand this a little bit further, let's try to look at the CAN frame itself. The CAN frame itself consists of an ID, which is an 11-bit field, a DLC, which is a data length indicator, which indicates what's the length of the data field itself. And then there is a CRC section, which is generated, a checksum, which is generated out of the whole frame before it's transmitted out. In order to detect errors in this particular system, the bus, when a ECU transmits bits out onto the bus, it also reads back the same bits from the bus. If the transmitted bits and the received bits on the bus are the same, it assumes that there isn't a failure and that it has been able to successfully transmit the frame onto the bus. Monitoring the TX bits and the RX bit on the bus helps make a determination of an error, and based on that, the error flags, a number of error flags or error types are raised as part of the protocol. The error handling mechanism of the CAN protocol keeps track of a number of errors, which and based on those errors, it takes a number of actions. The actions could include raising an error flag, retransmission of frames, as well as taking an ECU offline. The protocol, here we show a list of error types which the protocol requires to be set based on the different errors. For example, if the TX bit is not equal to the bits it reads off the bus, then a bit error is raised. Similarly, if there is a CRC error between the CRC which was transmitted and versus the one which is calculated after receiving the frame, then a CRC error is raised. So these are some of the examples of the error types which the protocol, the CAN protocol, requires to be set based on the detection of various errors in the system. Two particular counters defined within this protocol is very important and used and play a significant role in the protocol itself. One of them is the transmit error count. The other is the receive error count. Now, the way the protocol works is if during the process of transmission, the protocol detects an error, then the transmit error count is incremented by 8. However, during transmission, if the protocol detects a successful transmission, then the transmit error count is decremented by 1. Similarly, on the receiving side, if an error is detected, the receive error count is incremented by 1. Or similarly, when a frame is received successfully, error-free, then the receive error count is decremented by 1. So these two we will see further in the slide deck that these two error counts play a significant role in the overall error handling mechanism which the CAN protocol uses. So going a little bit further, here we show you the error handler state machine which the ECU uses. By default, each of the ECUs enter an error active state. That is the initial state where they are. And then as errors are detected or as transmission and receiving of frames happen on the CAN bus, the error counts are incremented or decremented. So at a point in time, if the error count becomes greater than 127, the ECU enters what is known as the error passive mode. So in this error passive mode, it stays in this error passive mode, and till the point either the error counts are decremented due to error-free bus, and the error count becomes less than 127, and we return back to an error active state from the error passive state, or in the case where the error count increments further and it exceeds 255, then the ECU enters what is known as a bus off state. This bus off state is a state where, depending on the manufacturer, some manufacturers will shut down the ECU itself, or some manufacturers shut down the entire CAN bus itself. And at that point in time, depending on the vehicle type, some vehicles will end up turning on the warning lamps and go into a mode of operation, a minimal mode of operation. Essentially, it requires the user of the vehicle to take the vehicle over to a manufacturer, a dealership, to have it checked out at that point in time. So this pretty much summarizes the rough error handling mechanism which the CAN bus uses. So this error handling mechanism has been very useful and very reliable for a number of years. The researchers, however, have used this to mount an attack. They use this as an attack vector for their attack, which they have called the bus off attack. The way they implement this bus off attack is that they inject a minimum number of frames into a healthy ECU, and the protocol itself assists the attacker by way of its own retransmission methods to amplify that attack and be able to accomplish, and the attacker is able to accomplish a bus off of the ECU itself. The basic requirements for this particular attack to be successful from an attacker's viewpoint is, number one, the ability for the attacker to inject frames, and the ability for the attacker to sniff frames from this in-vehicle bus. So what does it take to mount a successful attack? To mount a successful attack, the attacker needs to be able to inject a well-crafted frame with the right timing. So here we are showing a case of an injection of a frame. In the beginning, we see the error counter is 0, and the attacker then goes ahead and injects a well-crafted method, a well-crafted frame. At that point in time, you will see the error counter gets incremented because a transmit error is detected by the victim ECU, and because of retransmission mechanisms which are built into the protocol, you will that single injection is amplified, and the error counter gets incremented on its own over a period of time. When the error counter is further incremented because of further iterations of the process of injection of the well-crafted frame, we ultimately get to a point where the error counter has become more than 255, and at that point in time, the victim ECU enters the bus-off state. Depending on the vehicle manufacturer, we may see a complete shutdown of the CAN bus, or a shutdown of the ECU itself, along with warning lamps being turned on a real vehicle. To understand this a little bit further, let's try to understand a process known as arbitration. This is a process which each ECU goes through in order to take control of the bus. And in a typical normal scenario, there would be only one winner in this arbitration process in order for that particular ECU to take control of the bus and transmit. So here we are showing two nodes, node A and node B. And as part of the message, they are transmitting their IDs followed by data. Here node A and node B are both transmit their IDs, and they listen back at the messages on the bus. In the case of node B, when node B transmits the message on the bus, for every bit which it reads, at a point in time, it realizes it is, instead of getting the bit which it transmitted, it gets a lower value bit. In this case, or 0, it reads a 0, indicating that on the bus, there is another node which is transmitting, which has a lower ID value. And lower ID values are considered by the protocol to have a higher priority. And so at that point in time, node B relinquishes the control and enters into a receive mode. So that makes sure, in this arbitration mechanism, we make sure that an ID which has higher priority always wins in the arbitration mechanism. In this particular example, we've got node A, which has a higher ID, a lower ID, implying a higher priority, which wins every time over node B and takes control of the CAN bus. So what does it? So if an attacker, the way the attacker utilizes this particular knowledge of arbitration is the attacker crafts a attack message which has the same ID as the victim, and because it has the same ID as the victim, when it competes with other ECUs in the system, the attackers along with the victim together win in the arbitration phase. And so we end up with two winners in the arbitration phase. Going from the arbitration phase to the next phase, the attacker modifies the control data of the frame in order to be able to create a bit error. In this example, we see that the fourth bit in the control data has been modified by the attacker, compared to the fourth bit which the original victim had sent out. And so the victim ends up detecting the fact that the fourth bit is not a 1 anymore, and instead it's a 0. And so it flags that event as a bit error. Since it flags that event as a transmission error, even though it's not actually a transmission error for the victim, it incurs an error count increase, and that is the starting point of phase 1 of the attack. So in this mechanism, as we iterate through this process, we will get to a point where we will deceive the victim to think it is erroneous, and the error count would be increased to more than 255, and the ECU will enter a bus off state. So if we were to summarize this attack, what needs to happen in order for a successful bus off attack? For a successful bus off attack, the researchers list down three main criteria. Criteria 1 is that the attacker needs to be able to craft a message which has the same ID as the victim, and that is feasible, that is possible by the attacker being able to read messages on the broadcast bus. The second is the attacker being able to craft a message whereby every time it transmits the message, there will be a bit error. Though it is not trivial to understand the data associated with the transmission of a frame for a particular victim by just monitoring the bus, one of the fields within the message itself, called the DLC or the data length field, that can be set to 0 deliberately by the victim, which kind of guarantees that any message which the victim had generated will be a non-zero value and will result in a bit error if the attacker is able to send out the message at the same time as the victim. So the recommendation, or one way to make sure that you have different content which will always cause a bit error, is for the attacker to set a DLC which is equal to 0. The third criteria is being able to transmit the attacker's frame at exactly the same time as the victim itself. This is slightly difficult to achieve, but is needed in order to have 2 winners in the arbitration process. So transmission, because of delays and jitters in the process of transmitting a frame in the CAN bus, it can be overwhelming or sometimes very difficult to accomplish. The proposed idea which the researchers have put forward is known as preceded ID. So what is preceded ID? The preceded ID involves, in one observation which the researchers had done as part of normal transmission of frames within the CAN bus. So when more than one node in the CAN bus is ready to transmit packets, there is always an arbitration phase which happens, and one of the nodes is the winner of the arbitration. The observation is that the nodes which have lost the arbitration attempt for the first time will attempt to send packets, send the information which they have immediately after, as soon as the bus is available, after the previous transmission is completed. So here is an example of one such transmission. Say we have two nodes, node A and node B, and a message M1 arrives at a point in time. And node A is the winner of that arbitration. So M1 gets transmitted. During this phase of transmission, we have two messages, M3 and M2, which are also ready for transmission. But since the message M1 is being transmitted at that point in time, they both have to wait. At the point in time where M1, transmission of M1 has been completed and the bus becomes available, there is an arbitration phase which both node A and node B enter into. Again, because node A in this particular case has a higher priority, node A wins in the process of arbitration and node B loses. So we end up with transmitting M2 on the bus, on the CAN bus, and M3 waits. At the end of transmission of M2, M3 gets transmitted. So as you can see down below on the CAN bus, you see a specific order of messages. You see a specific order of messages between node A and node B. So if the attacker observes this pattern of messages at a point in time, the attacker can establish which message precedes which particular message. In this particular case, we say M2 precedes M1, M3 precedes M2. So an attacker, in order for an attacker to utilize this mechanism, the attacker needs to be able to know exactly when a particular message will be transmitted by a node in the CAN bus and time the transmission of the attack message at that particular point in time. In this particular case, the attacker has studied and has observed that M3 will get transmitted as soon as M2's transmission is completed. So the attacker waits to inject the attack message. After M2 has completed, the attacker injects the attack message at the same time as M3 and accomplishes generating a bit error in node B. So in order for the researchers to be able to analyze that mechanism of precedence, the researchers observed or studied logs which were provided by the University of Tulsa in Oklahoma for a 2010 Toyota Camry. And the data indicates that there is significant occurrences of precedents or precedent IDs which can be utilized in a real world scenario as well. So with that in mind, the researchers went ahead and ran actual experiments or evaluation of their theory. The evaluation was done on a CAN node prototype running on an Arduino Uno and a couple of real vehicles as well, a 2013 Honda Accord and a 2016 Hyundai Sonata. Here down below we show the actual CAN node prototype setup. Here you see 3 Arduinos, each of them labeled to represent a victim, an adversary, and a non-victim. The results of that test were as expected, as we showed down below over here in figure 1. In phase 1, the phase where both the victim as well as the attacker enter an error passive state with just one message, the researchers accomplished phase 1 in about 2 millisecond time frame. This was because there is a lot of retransmissions which help in amplify the attack. And further iteration of this process, this shows the victim enter into a bus-off state, while the attacker recovers back to the error active state. So the results were as expected from the theoretical knowledge which the researchers had developed by observing and studying the CAN protocol. Similar, looking a little bit further, here we do see the 2 phases, the error counts of the 2 phases. In phase 1, we see that within about 2 millisecond time, we have accomplished going into the error passive state. And in phase 2, as we iterate further, we see increments of 7 as shown as proven theoretically, and it shows the exact properties in order before going into an ECU going into a bus-off state. These were observations which were made as part of the running tests on the CAN prototypes. Now coming to the actual vehicles test, the evaluation on real vehicles, the prototypes were connected through the OBD2 interface of both the Honda Accord as well as the Hyundai Sonata systems, and it was observed that on both vehicles, the error counts were incremented, and as further iteration of the process was done, one could see bus off of ECUs happening on the real vehicles and warning lamps getting turned on. So these two experiments in the real world as well as the prototypes prove that the researchers' idea of a bus-off attack. So the researchers now would like to propose a couple of countermeasures. So the countermeasures which the researchers would like to propose in phase 1, due to retransmission of frames, the observation was at least 2 consecutive errors will occur with an active error flag. So one of the countermeasures is to watch for error frames, consecutive error frames with an active flag, while having an active error flag. And in the second phase, due to the difference of error modes, the observation was made that even though the victim is in error passive mode and its error count is increasing, at around the same time, another message with the same ID was being successfully transmitted by some other ECU on the bus. So that is an indication that a bus-off attack is at that point in time in the process of happening, and the countermeasure would be, that would be a point in time in which the researchers would like vehicle manufacturers to take preventative countermeasures. So in order to prove those, the researchers ran further tests. They simulated the probability of the countermeasure F1, where we see evidence of that error condition happening under uncompromised situation. The probability of F1 happening under an uncompromised ECU was found to be 0, while the probability of F1 occurring during a bus-off attack was equal to 1. The researchers concluded that F1 should be considered to be an indication of a bus-off attack. The reason they wanted to call it an indication because it could also happen if one had a bad transmitter in real life. However, the occurrence of F2, the fact that one has error counts increase while at the same time have messages with the same ID on the ECU bus being successfully transmitted, the researchers consider that to be an evidence of a bus-off attack. And so the proposed countermeasure by researchers was that in the case where there is both an indication of a bus-off attack as well as an evidence of a bus-off attack, the researchers would like the vehicle manufacturers to shut down a compromised ECU under those conditions. That would prevent a bus-off attack from happening. So in conclusion, this particular paper shows us that even though the CAN error handling mechanism has been very useful for vehicle manufacturers to develop fault tolerance within modern cars, it could be used as an attack vector. They have been able to successfully demonstrate a bus-off attack in a CAN prototype as well as a couple of real vehicles. And at the end of it, the researchers provide a set of countermeasures to prevent such bus-off attack. The researchers would further like vehicle manufacturers to analyze these countermeasures and see whether they can be successfully used in all cases of bus-off attacks. And that concludes my presentation for this particular paper. Thank you.